When Christy was born, Paul was 6 years old. He clearly remembers how his mother had a big belly for a long time, and then his dad took her somewhere. For a while, Dad and son were left alone. Father used to smile enigmatically. They also did housework together. They cleaned, washed the windows, and cooked their food. Paul liked it, but he missed his mother. Dad said to be a little patient, and Mom will come back. Soon, the mom returned, and she was not alone. Dad held a white envelope with a pink ribbon tied in his hands and solemnly announced, "This is your little sister. Will you love her?" Paul peered cautiously at the little face of his sister. She was looking at him. The mother, seeing her son's confusion, asked, "Do you like your little sister? What would you call her?" "Christy," the boy answered, difficulty moving his stare away from the baby. "And I will call her Christy the Nugget. She's just like the nuggets that Grandma makes, small and a little shriveled." Mom and Dad laughed, but Paul at that moment started to feel responsible, because from now on, she was in his care, Christy the Nugget, and now he's an older brother. Paul himself dreamed of an older brother who would protect him, but it is impossible. Now he will be the older brother who will protect Christy. Christy took her first steps towards her brother. Here's how it happened. The whole family had been waiting for this. One day, Paul ran back home from school, afraid that he had missed this important moment. He hastily changed and ran to his sister while the mother was setting the table. Christy stood holding on to her bed. Paul sat down against the wall and stretched out his arms to her. She was a little afraid, but took a step forward. Paul saw how she was swaying a little, and he wanted to jump up and hug her, as he thought that she would suddenly fall, but he stopped himself when he saw that she was taking a second step. Mom came to call Paul for dinner and froze in the doorway, seeing how Christy was walking towards her brother, and she smiled and took her hands closer to her. In the evening, Paul and the mother, interrupting each other, told everything to the father, and then they all sat together on the floor and Christy stomped from one to the other. Everyone laughed. So that's how they lived together. Paul used to help his mother after school. In the evenings and on weekends, the whole family walked together in the park, and during the holidays, Paul himself walked with his little sister so Mom could rest. And it was not difficult for him to roll a stroller in the yard. Paul's friends laughed at the boy every time he went out into the street with his sister. 2-year-old Christy did not leave her brother alone for a second, and Paul sometimes even refused to play with the boys who invited him, saying, "No, I don't want the ball to hit Christy's head. And also, it is inconvenient to play hide and seek with a 2-year-old child." So brother and sister grew up together. Christy trusted Paul with all her girlish secrets. He never laughed at it and seriously listened to the news that Jimmy did not love her and the math teacher was too strict. No one even tried to offend Christy at school. Everyone knew that her older brother was protecting her. Paul announced this to everyone back in September, in the 1st grade. Paul always did chores with his little sister. He accompanied her to music school, fed her dinner if their parents were late at work, and in general was happy that there was his nugget. "Oh, you will be a good husband, Paul," said the old neighbor Melissa. "No way I will let my brother have any wife. I'll marry him myself," seriously answered Christy. In response, Paul only laughed and hugged her. Later, they laughed together, remembering this incident. After his graduation, Paul entered a technical school. But just like before, he used to visit his sister at school so that the bullies would not forget who they should not target. Although by this time, Christy could care for herself. After all, Paul taught her many self-defense techniques and how to verbally respond to offenders too. After college, Paul was drafted into the Army. He did not try to evade because his father and grandfather also have been in the Army. Paul broke up with his girlfriend a month before, so he was leaving with confidence. After all, Paul saw many girls who didn't wait for their boyfriends to come back from the Army, and he won't have to be doing his duty with a broken heart. Paul only worried about his sister, so he gave her a lot of lessons before he left while Christy was looking at him with her brown eyes and trying to convince her brother that everything would be fine. The day for Paul to join the Army has come. Paul's friends have met him at his home. Mom cooked a lot of delicious food. She and Paul's father proudly looked at their grown son and tried not to show how much they were worried. Christy sobbed a lot during the farewell to her brother. She couldn't hold back her tears. They just flowed like a continuous stream. "Don't cry, sis," the brother tried to calm her. "I'll bring you a cartridge case." "Oh, bring it!" Christy hugged Paul around the neck. "And what's most important, Come back alive. What could happen? I'll do my best and come back. Christy checked her mailbox every day because Paul often wrote letters to her. She was delighted with the first letter by mail, and so the tradition began. Sometimes they called each other, but not much. But for the last 3 weeks, there have been no letters from her brother. Instead, another letter came, saying that Paul would not return. The news that Paul died during his duty came by official mail. The father tried to calm his girls as best he could. He would have cried himself too, or rather, he would even howl. But he had no right to. He had to support his wife and daughter. Christy at that moment matured. She saw how her parents suffered because of her sorrow. She pulled herself together, even though it was not easy at all. Christy didn't shed a tear at the funeral of her brother. Now, only a picture of him saw her tears. So she thought when she told the news in a whisper at night and cried, looking at the photo of Paul. But the parents heard that, although Christy thought they were sleeping. The details of Paul's death were told by his mate. "I'm Michael," said the young man who appeared on the threshold of the house of Paul's parents. He was embarrassed, held the blue beret in his hands, and carefully chose his words. The parents recognized him. Paul used to write to Christy about his friend Michael. "We were on duty together," Michael said. And Christy, resting her chin on her palm, looked at the young man with all her eyes. After all, he was the last one her brother saw. "Paul used to tell us a lot about you." Michael looked away in embarrassment. "He said that you were the best sis in the world." "You exaggerate. Paul is the best, not me," said Christy. No matter how hard she restrained herself, tears rolled down from her eyes. "Anyways, he told me to keep an eye on you, so if there's anything I can help you with, ask me." Michael returned to his home. He lived in a neighboring town. Meanwhile, Christy grew up. The image of her beloved brother was erased from her memory with the passing of time. The girl had an adult life. In the second year of the institute she was attending, she fell in love with George. She considered him as her one and only. He sought her for a long time, beautifully courted. It seemed to Christy that he even looked like her brother, mostly because of how he talked. There was no outward resemblance. One day, Christy came to George to tell him very important news. She was happy and excited at the same time. On her way, she bought some cakes for tea. Christy had her own keys, even though they did not live together. When the kettle was already boiling in the kitchen, George entered the apartment. "Christy, why are you so early today? Did you skip your study?" "George, I want to tell you the important news." Christy stared at her boyfriend in the eyes. "I'm pregnant!" "What?" George even fell down on the chair in surprise. "What do you mean you're pregnant? We're gonna have a baby. Tell me, are we getting married?" Unfortunately, marriage was definitely not included in the plans of the young man. Yes, he liked Christy. He was ready to date her, but not to marry. He had his studies and plans for life, in which his wife, and even more so the child, were not included at all. Christy does not remember well what happened next. She did not expect her beloved to refuse to marry and reject their baby. She remembered George's words that it was too early for them to become parents, that she took the money from him, put it in her purse, and then went home, barely standing on her legs. In general, Christy was left alone, or rather, not alone, with an unborn child whom she did not want to get rid of, no matter how much George tried to convince her. Of course, her parents accepted the choice of her daughter to keep the baby, but she had to quit her studies. The pregnancy was difficult. Christy was constantly nauseous. For the last 2 months, she practically could not leave the house at all, and when the birth date approached, she realized with horror that she would have to raise her child alone. As always, crying, she used to tell everything to the photo of her brother. If her brother were here, he would recognize a scoundrel in George. Anyway, she had to calm down, because the unborn child feels everything too. Christy didn't let her parents tell Michael anything about this situation. He supported Christy as much as he could, and he tried to find out who she was dating, but she didn't want him to know anything. Christy was waiting for the birth of her child she loved, despite the betrayal of her ex, because the child is not to blame. When the contractions started, the parents were at home. That weekend, they were just going to go looking for a crib for the baby, because the birth date was set for that week, but the child decided to do it his own way. The birth was not entirely easy. Fortunately, the mom and baby were healthy, and that is the most important thing. Christy looked at her son and smiled when a ward mate came in with a bouquet. "They brought you a bouquet again," a ward mate, Amy, who had already given birth to her third baby, poked Christy. "The third bouquet in 3 days already. And they say you don't have a husband. Who's trying so hard?" "Well, I really don't know." Christy held her newborn son in her arms. "Maybe it's not for me at all. They made a mistake." "Yeah, we have a lot of Christy Allens at the maternity hospital." Pleased with her joke, Amy laughed. "Hush you! You'll wake him up." Christy shushed her. "Don't worry. Children in the first days do not hear anything, even if a siren yells over their ear. It is your baby's dad who brings the bouquets, isn't it?" "We don't have a dad," Christy snapped. "I will raise my son myself." The day for the new mom and baby to come home has arrived. Christy was worried. No one but her parents would come for her. Somewhere inside her, there is a glimmer of hope that George would change his mind. And then she threw those thoughts away. After all, a person who betrayed once will definitely betray again. Christy decided that she will raise her son with her parents. They are looking forward to their daughter and grandson coming home. Parents said they prepared everything. Christy sent them a photo of their grandson, and they were arguing over who he looked more like. "Hurry up! Parents are waiting for you. I've already dressed your child," said the nurse who entered the ward. "Almost done. Mom and Dad, or rather grandfather and grandmother, can wait," Christy smiled. However, it was not Mom and Dad who were waiting for her on the porch of the maternity hospital. Rather, they also waited, but stood a little further. Michael was standing next to his car. Seeing Christy with her son in her arms, he jumped up to her and carefully pulled back a corner of the blanket and looked at the child. And then he seriously asked, "Shall we call him Paul, Christy the Nugget?" Christy silently nodded, and a tear rolled down her cheek, which Michael saw. "What's that, Christy? Everything will be fine. Do you trust me?" She did not answer, but simply leaned her head against Michael's shoulder and looked at her son, at her Paul.